Alright, this is a video to complete the lecture on Hume, which we didn't finish in our classroom. Where we ended was we finished our discussion of Hume's view of the circumstances of justice. So we saw that Hume thinks that justice is a solution to a problem, and the problem is created by two, maybe three, depending on how you count, conditions. One being scarcity. In the state of nature, there isn't enough to just go around and make everybody have what they desire. Two, limited benevolence, or maybe bias, or limited altruism, some form of limited egoism. The idea that we could work hard enough to transform the situation of scarcity into one of abundance and prosperity, but naturally we don't have the motivation to do that. To be motivated to do that naturally, we'd have to be very altruistic, consider other people's interests and ends and goals in life just as important as our own, and we don't. So that's a second condition. The third condition is one. So those are two that Rawls discusses too. Those are the two that matter the most. There's a third one Hume mentions, which is to do with the fact that property or possessions are interchangeable. They can be used by one person and another, and if I have some food to eat, then this is food that could feed you too, and that creates instability, he thinks. And so justice, he thinks, so this is where we'll be picking up, justice is a solution to that problem, and it solves the problem by making our possessions stable. He gives a proto-Adam Smithian argument. He says, look, the way that we make the scarce state of nature into an abundant or prosperous society is by having a division of labor. We split up the work and we become more efficient at what we do, and that's how we create wealth. Okay, so how do we get there? Well, what we need to do first and foremost is we need to have people have stability of possessions, so that we can expect that what we work on be there tomorrow, that we can expect a return on our efforts, and so on. That's the point of justice. Now, once we have that in place, Hume thinks things are very different from the way that Hobbes, for example, thinks it. So if you remember from our lecture, Hume is disagreeing with Locke. He doesn't think that justice is natural like Locke would think. He thinks justice is artificial. But he also disagrees with Hobbes. Hobbes thinks that justice creates, or the cooperation, obeying the rules of justice, creates a prisoner's dilemma unless we have the state punishing it. Hume disagrees with this. He thinks it's not a prisoner's dilemma, it's a convention. And so he compares justice with two people rowing a boat, for example. I'll get to that in a second. But so here are two quotes, right? So he's very clear about this. He says, it's a convention entered into by all members of society to bestow stability on the possessions, leave everyone in the peaceable enjoyment of what they may acquire by their fortune and industry. Of course, industry is important there. And it's a general sense of common interest, which sends all members of society express to one another and which induces them to regulate their conduct by certain rules. I observe that it will be for my interest to leave another in the possession of his goods, provided he will act in the same manner with regard to me. So that's very different from Hobbes, right? Hobbes says it's actually in your interest to steal other people's possessions if you can get away with it. Hume says if you know that the other people are obeying the rules, really they're sitting ducks, this is a golden opportunity, you should not take the golden opportunity, you should refrain from stealing. It's in my interest, he says. I observe that it will be before my interest to leave another in the possession of his goods. When this common sense of interest is mutually expressed and is known to both, it produces a suitable resolution and behavior. So, Hume thinks justice is a convention, he means it. Right? He compares people who follow the rules of justice as two men who pull the oars of a boat. One of the reading questions was about this. It's an analogy, right? Hume is not just making a point about rowing. He's using this to learn something or to tell us something about justice. So, well, how does it go in a boat? Well, you don't have to make an explicit promise. You kind of sort of automatically start rowing at the same time, right? Or maybe alternating. First the one on the right, then the one on the left, then the one on the right. If you don't coordinate, you're not going to get anywhere. But once you do coordinate, you don't really need any enforcement. You don't need a sovereign to threaten you, like, oh, keep rowing at the same time, or else. People do it automatically because it's in their interest. They both want to get somewhere, and they both know that if they don't keep rowing at the same time, well, they won't get there. Of course, it's in every individual person's interest to, to row a little less, but cooperation is needed, and we can all see that we should cooperate. And so Hume thinks the same with justice. That's the point of the analogy with the boat. So he says, in one instance, the public be a sufferer, this momentary ill is amply compensated by the steady prosecution of the rule. So he says, sometimes following the rules of justice stinks, right? Let's say you accidentally crash into my car and you have to pay for the repairs. That's going to cost you money. That stinks. So, well, why should you do it anyway? He says, well, it's a momentary ill, but you're amply compensated by the steady prosecution of the rule, by the peace and the order. So overall, this is so beneficial to you that you'll see that it's in your interest to pay, even though in the short run this is a bad thing for you. But so here it is, right? The final sentence of this quote. Hume thinks, this is an idea about justice that we'll see Rawls pick up on. It's really important that justice means that every individual must find himself a gainer on balancing the account. So living under justice must be good for everybody. Everybody must benefit. Or else it's not justice. So it's possible for a society to be really rich, say, by having a majority exploit a minority. Think of sort of like your paradigmatic slave society. It's very good for the plantation owners to have slaves, but it's not good for the slaves, and so Hume says that cannot be justice. That's not going to be stable in the way that rowing a boat is. If the slaves had a choice, they would walk away. So there's a tool here of thinking about justice. And you can think about a society and like, look, are people having to be forced by sword, by the force of law, by threat, to obey the rules? If so, something should be wrong if you believe in Hume. All right, so quickly, the convention model of justice is very different from the prisoner's dilemma. Right? So remember the kind of matrix that we discussed with Hobbes. Right? Suppose two people have a dispute about justice. A thinks that justice requires one thing, X. B thinks that justice requires something else, Y. 1, 2, 3, 4 again are the options ranked, right? 1 being best, 4 being worst. What we have here is something different from a prisoner's dilemma. If you remember, in a prisoner's dilemma, it was always in your interest to cheat, right? To do what you want to do, irrespective of what the other person wants to do. But here, that's not true, right? Think about it from person A's perspective. Person A thinks, well, what might person B do? Person B might choose X or choose Y, so be on the left or on the right side. So what person A gets to do is choose the rows, right? Choose up or down. Now suppose that person B chooses to follow rules X, so we're on the left side of the matrix. Now what person A should do is, well, 1 is better than 3, so person A should follow X 2. So what we have now is person A and person B following the same rules, rules X. Now this is great for A, of course, because it gets his best option. Suppose that person B says, well, actually I'm going to follow rules Y. So we're going to be on the right side of the matrix. What should person A do now? In a prisoner's dilemma, you should do the same thing still, right? Follow rules X. But now, for person A, things are very different. 2, which is following Y as well, is better than 4, which would be following X. And so it depends on what person B does for person A. If person B chooses rules X, person A should also choose rules X. That is 1 over 3. If person B chooses rules Y, then A should also choose Y. That's 2 over 4. Of course, the flip side is true as well, right? Person B does best when he follows the same rules as person A. If person A follows X, then we're on the top side. Then person B can choose left or right. So that's 2 or 3. 2 beats 3, so person B will follow rules X. Both parties will follow the same rules. Person A chooses to follow rules Y, we're on the bottom side of the matrix. So person B can choose left or right again, that's 4 versus 1. Well, 1 easily beats 4, so If person A follows rules Y, then person B, it's in his or her interest to follow rules Y as well. So what you get is there are two stable outcomes, right? We can either be on the top left side where both parties follow rule X, or we can be on the bottom right side where both parties follow rules Y. Once we are in one of these two boxes, even though one person will be guaranteed to be following a rule that they don't like, by stipulation they could be doing something better from their point of view, it is not in their interest to change their behavior unilaterally. It's in their interest to stay keeping the same thing. So this is the convention, right? Once we're coordinating, once we're rowing at the same time, it's in our interest to do the same thing. I think in class I used the example of subway tunnels. When there's a lot of people during peak hour walking through subway tunnels, everyone starts walking on the same side of the tunnel. We don't look out for each other anymore because we don't have to because we don't expect anyone to step out of line. Even if you prefer to walk on the other side of the tunnel, given that people are walking on this side, it's in your interest to walk on this side too. That's generally how a convention works, and Hume thinks that justice is like that. It's not a prisoner's dilemma. It's not in your interest to cheat, to break out of line, to go walk on the other side because everyone is walking on one side. It's like a convention. It's in your interest to walk on the same side as everybody else. And his argument is, in the long run, there are so many benefits here that you'd be crazy to break the line. Okay, so here are a couple of lessons, Humean lessons, we might say. Lessons for thinking about justice as we move on. Among the circumstances of justice, Hume includes a kind of selfishness. But what he means is what Rawls discusses as the subjective circumstances of justice. He means you're not fully altruistic. So it's just a kind of limited or moderate selfishness. It's not selfishness like Hobbes. Right? Hobbes thinks you ultimately only care about yourself. It matters. Right? What prevents us from being productive is not that we prefer to gain at the expense of others. That's what Hobbes thinks. Right? Like the best deal is that other people do all the work and you just take their stuff. That's not what Hume thinks. Hume thinks, no, we care about other people. It's just we don't only care about them. We also care about ourselves. So if we're going to work for others, we want to stand to gain from ourselves too, for ourselves too. So the problem is the opposite, right? It's not that everybody is trying to live off everybody else's and on everybody else's dime. Instead, the problem is that in a state of nature without justice, we might not be able to live on our own dime. We might not be able to gain at all from our own work because others might seek to gain at our expense. That's the problem. I think that's a pretty deep insight actually into what justice is and what the problem is. So the problem is, Hume thinks, that absent the rules of justice, the world becomes zero-sum. People fear that others might gain at their expense. So for one person to get something means for another person to get less, and vice versa. And so Hume thinks that justice is really about changing that, changing the world from being zero-sum, where we do gain at each other's expense, or where one person's success threatens another person's success, and changing it into what is a society that is positive sum, where one person's success actually does not threaten another person's success, but where one person's gaining can also mean another person's gaining. And he thinks that stability of possession, property rights, and so on is the key. Basically, think about it this way, right? If you have a little shop, you might sell some goods. This is your customer gains from this because they get something they otherwise wouldn't have had, but you also get something by making a profit. That's the kind of world that Hume envisions. To get there, we need to accept certain constraints. Right? Because naturally, we're not disposed to do this, to leave each other in their stable possessions. There is somebody sitting on the hill in his big villa with silver spoons and what have you not, right? Naturally, we think if we don't know this person, nobody's looking, you might sneak in and take a nap in their bed, or maybe, take one or two of the silver spoons. Who'll notice the difference? You might like to get some more. You might be maximizing your utility, if you want to use the technical phrase. To get from a world that is like that where we will take from each other in order to gain, and move towards a world where it's positive sum, we need to accept constraints. We need to accept that we can't just go into the shop and take what we want, but we have to pay for it. Now, remember, right? He says, look, that stinks sometimes, because you might want the money for something else, or you might want to not pay at all. You might want to have it all. But in the long run, this is much better. Those are these kind of constraints. These are what help us leave the state of nature without justice and get to a stable society. So we can formulate a Humean test. The test would be this, right? A theory of justice succeeds insofar as it helps us transform a situation in which people ends are in conflict or zero sum into one in which people's ends are mutually reinforcing or positive sum. That is, if you think Hume is right about what he says about the circumstances of justice, and if you think Hume is right about what it means or what it takes to change that situation, then you have a kind of mutual advantage view coming up. Right? Justice is about making sure that we can all pursue our own ends simultaneously with other people pursuing theirs, and hopefully make our actions so that my pursuing my ends is good news for you. It's not a threat.